Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem. In the movie Kingdom of Heaven, he was portrayed as wanting peace with Saladin. But is there any truth to that portrayal? Or was Baldwin IV in fact a tough young warrior king, committed to the crusade, and determined to take the fight to Islam and defeat Saladin? We'll find out today on the Real Crusades History podcast with our guest, Dr. Helena Schrader. Hey, welcome everybody again for Real Crusades History. I'm J. Stephen Roberts, and I'm here once more with Deanna Proach. Deanna, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you, Stephen?
I'm doing good. I am excited, actually, that we are having Dr. Helena Schrader on our show once again. So, Helena's going to talk with us today about Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, who's kind of become, again, because of the movie Kingdom of Heaven, he's kind of become a pretty well-known figure in the popular culture. He was the king featured in that movie, and of course, one of the defining characteristics of Baldwin IV was that he suffered from leprosy at a time when it was probably pretty rough being a leper king. When it would normally be rough, it was very rough in the late 1170s and 1180s in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So Helena, how are you doing today?
Very good, thank you. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thank you very much for being with us. So let's kind of jump into our topic. So again, Baldwin IV has gone down in history as the Leper King. Can you tell us why?
Well, as you said yourself, because he was suffering from leprosy. And as far as I know, he's the only crowned and anointed king in European history, if you can count the Crusader kingdoms to European history, who actually suffered from leprosy, at least while he was reigning.
So then, how was it possible for someone suffering from such a debilitating disease to become king? Weren't lepers segregated from society and ostracized in the Middle Ages?
Yes and no. Until quite recently, there was no known cure for leprosy, and medieval medicine neither understood the causes of the disease nor possessed adequate means of treating or containing it. So what happened was, as early as the 4th century AD, we heard about leprosariums, which were essentially hospitals for lepers, particularly in Constantinople and Alexandria, where lepers were being treated and more or less segregated from society because some people believed that even just breathing the same air as lepers could cause you to catch the disease. But in fact, the leprosariums were not prisons. They were not designed to punish or even confine lepers, because medieval man also knew that some people, the people who worked in these leprosariums, often worked there for years without ever getting the disease. So there was sort of ambiguous attitudes saying that, yes, they should be segregated and they needed special help. At the same time, people could work with them and not catch the disease. So there was no clear-cut prohibition against contact between lepers and the rest of society.
Okay, so tell me this, Helena. Were lepers seen as sinners being punished by God for their sins and therefore kind of a shunned segment of society?
At this time, no. Actually, it was considered a sign of grace, particularly in Byzantium. The Byzantines came to call leprosy the holy disease, and there are a number of Greek Orthodox legends in which Christ appears as a leper, and he basically tests your faith by whether you're willing to help him, although the fact he is suffering from leprosy. So that there's this clear tradition in Byzantium, and Byzantium had much more influence on the Crusader kingdoms than did, say, Judaism, which clearly saw leprosy as a reason for being thrown out of the community. So, as I say, the Crusader Jerusalem basically accepted the more Byzantium attitudes towards leprosy, that it was basically a sign of grace, and people who helped lepers were in effect helping Christ, were being good Christians. And this is underlined by the fact that, in fact, an entire order, the Knights of St. Lazarus, was formed in Jerusalem in the second decade of the 12th century, an outgrowth of an earlier Byzantine or Armenian leper hospital.
Okay. But all lepers were required to join the Knights of St. Lazarus. Am I correct?
No, they were required to. What the militant orders, like the Templars and the Hospitallers, required their members to join the Knights of St. Lazarus if they became leprous. And according to some of the laws that we have from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, it appears that noblemen in the kingdom who came down with leprosy were expected, it's a question of required to, were expected to join the Order of St. Lazarus. And that's why a lot of historians have looked at Baldwin and said, well, he was a nobleman, he was a top nobleman in the kingdom. He should too have been required to join the Order of St. Lazarus, but he clearly wasn't. When his father died, he was already suffering from leprosy, but the High Court of Jerusalem chose him as the heir. And this probably had to do simply with the fact that the alternative to Baldwin would have been one of his two sisters, Sibylla or Isabella, both of whom were underage and unmarried. And of course, that raises real huge problems, because if you have the Constitution of Jerusalem said that women could not reign without a consort, and since neither Sibylla or Isabella were married at the time of their father's death, they would have had to find a consort. Finding a consort for a reigning queen was likely to be more divisive than taking this young man who was suffering from leprosy. So as I said, they chose Baldwin over his two sisters. A third factor probably in that decision was the fact that at 13, when he took over from his father, Baldwin was not yet disfigured or crippled by the disease.
So at what point did he start to become, did he start to show visible signs of the disease?
Well, they say quite young, and it was his tutor, the then Archdeacon of Tyre, who first discovered that he didn't have any feeling in his lower right arm. So that was, they don't give the exact age, but let's say 8 or 9, a young boy, certainly before the age of 13. But what we know now is that at that time, on the basis of what William Tyre wrote, the arm was not yet discolored or disfigured. All it had, the only symptom was a lack of feeling. So what we know, with what we know now about leprosy, we can be pretty certain that at the time, Baldwin only initially suffered from what's called primary polyneuritic tuberculoid leprosy. Hope I'm saying that right for those people who have a medical background. And that does not have devastating deforming effects that lepromatous leprosy has. So we also know that Baldwin was a very agile rider in his youth, and we can assume, therefore, again, that he was suffering from this other type of leprosy, this tuberculoid leprosy, which doesn't have disfiguring effects, and that's therefore, in the early part of his reign, he didn't look like a leper, as we conceive of him. He also would have had almost complete control of his body. And we can go from that, saying the High Court looks at a 13-year-old, he looks good, he looks healthy, he's agile, he's a good rider, and they probably hoped that the disease simply wouldn't deteriorate any further.
And we do know that in his later years, his body did start to deform and decay, but when exactly?
As I say, based on medical knowledge today, we know that puberty itself can induce a deterioration of tuberculoid leprosy into lepromatous leprosy. Another thing which can induce the deterioration is the untended wounds, which often occur when, because of a loss of feeling in the limbs of someone with the tuberculoid leprosy, they don't take care of the ulcers, or they don't take care of cuts, and they then become ulcerous. So what we have is that Baldwin, at the age of 16, so in puberty, leads the very dramatic campaign against Saladin that ends in the surprise victory at Montsegar. And I hypothesize that the combination of being in puberty and being in the field where he wasn't able to tend to his legs and wash his hands and his feet as he normally would have done probably led to the disease deteriorating into, as we say, lepromatous leprosy. Am I saying that correctly? I'm probably not. And we also know now that if you develop lepromatous leprosy while still young, it is almost certain that it will lead to death. So that once Baldwin's leprosy had become lepromatous, it inevitably took that course through the gruesome stages of increasing incapacitation and disfigurement to death, to an early death. He died before he was 24.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Baldwin's condition was deteriorating throughout his reign.
Exactly. And as I say, what starts with only numbness in his right hand, at the time, it turns by the, it gets worse and worse. But at 16, he was still capable of commanding his army on horseback without any notable restrictions on his mobility or his energy. But in 1179, just 2 years later, when he's unhorsed at the engagement on the Litani, he's unable to remount. And we have to stress, if there's nothing unusual about a knight being unhorsed, well, it's bad enough, but a knight would normally have been able to remount if he wasn't surrounded by the enemy. In other words, you have a situation here where Baldwin is surrounded by his own knights, and he can't get back on his horse. That suggests that he's lost the use of his arms. He had to be carried off the field by one of his knights on his back, on the knight's back. And that suggests, as I say, that between 1177, when he leads the campaign at Montségard, and 1179, his arms, he's lost the use of his arms. Within 5 years, by 1182, Baldwin's unable to even mount a horse, even under any circumstances, and has to lead his armies from a litter. So by that time, he's probably already lost the use of his legs as well as his arms. Possibly his eyesight was going too, because that's also typical of leprosy at this stage. So this is, and a year later in 1183, he tries to abdicate, again, because of his physical incapacity. There's no question that he was mentally still fit, as was proven by the fact that when Guy de Lusignan lost the trust of the barons and they refused to follow him any further, Baldwin took the reins of the kingdom again and took command and goes to the relief of Carac and saves it. Basically sends Saladin to flight. Although again he was being led from a litter, so mentally he's still fine, but his body has deteriorated from being capable of leading an army in 16 and 1177 to being completely incapacitated by 1183.
Well, despite the fact that Baldwin was so terribly ill and his body was decaying, he was a very valiant and courageous king, and he accomplished a lot. So Tell us about his accomplishments.
But I guess what I would say it's the greatest tragedy of his life is that we remember him as the leper king, and we ought to remember him as being a brilliant strategist, tactician, and diplomat who retained the loyalty of his notoriously independent vassals and repeatedly defeated full-scale invasion attempts by Saladin. As I say, he trounced Saladin at the Battle of Montgisard in 1177, something which deserves a complete podcast on its own, I would say.
I'd agree.
He held Saladin's forces at the Litani and might have routed them if the Templars hadn't attacked on their own in 1179. He fought Saladin to a standstill at La Fourbelet in 1182. He broke a sea and land siege of Beirut in 1182. He twice relieved sieges of Carac in 1182 and 1183, both times forcing Saladin to, pack up and go home. In short, he defeated 3 full-scale invasions and 3 dangerous sieges in the space of 6 years. That's pretty impressive for any 16 to 22-year-old, even if he hadn't been suffering from leprosy. I guess I don't even go on to say that there's no reason to suspect that he would have been defeated in 1187. There's no reason to think that he would not, let's put it this way, he never would have been drawn into the battle at Hattin because he knew how to defeat Saladin, and that wasn't by going to places where his army didn't have access to water.
One thing that Baldwin IV's reign really shows to me is that the kingdom was not in some kind of state of decline. I think there's kind of this false idea that after the failure of the Second Crusade, you kind of see this long, slow slide into decline. Well, especially after the failure of the Crusaders to conquer Egypt under Baldwin IV's father. But I think that, again, I mean, like you're talking about, Helena, these repeated invasions by Saladin that were defeated. Saladin should have been able to easily deal with these operations. I mean, assuming the resources he had at his disposal because of his possession of Egypt. I mean, and yet he wasn't able to.
We have Saladin. I think we should never forget that Saladin unites Syria and Egypt, and during his lifetime. It's not until I'm forgetting the exact date, but I think it's 1165 or 66 that Saladin unites takes over in Egypt and defeats the Fatimid Caliphate there. Until that moment, the Crusaders had been fighting divided Islam. They'd had Shias in Egypt and they'd had Sunnis in Syria. And they'd been able to very effectively play them off against each other and support, Aleppo against Mosul and Damascus against Cairo. And all of this played all these games very, very effectively to keep the enemy divided. Under Saladin, the Muslims become united. After he takes Egypt, so he eliminates the Shia control of Egypt, and then he takes over. He usurps from the rightful heir of Nur ad-Din the kingdom, the caliphate in Damascus. And then he still have to defeat Aleppo and Mosul, and it's not a simple thing. But throughout his reign, Saladin is getting stronger, and he's increasing the encirclement of the kingdom of Jerusalem. So whereas Baldwin's father could attack Egypt, the kingdom of Jerusalem was so strong, and the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt was so weak.
Yes.
By Baldwin IV's reign, he fights defensive battles. He cannot take the war to the enemy. Every one of his battles is defensive.
Yes.
He uses his forces effectively in all of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also a testament to how effective a political unit the Kingdom of Jerusalem really was. I mean, they were able to rally around, an ill king and still give their full allegiance to him. I know Stephen Runciman in his book even, I'm not a huge fan of Stephen Runciman, but he did point out that, look, in the late 1170s and early 1180s, the Kingdom of Jerusalem is in a healthy condition. There was no indication that it was falling apart.
No.
I'm going to come in here and say, I'm going to challenge that it was falling apart. I don't think it was falling apart. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was not falling apart. What happens is that in 1186, there's a usurpation of the throne by Guy de Lusignan and Sibylla against the will of the High Court, which is against the constitution of the kingdom. And that divides the kingdom for the first time. As long as you had legitimate kings, which was Baldwin IV and even Baldwin V, the kingdom is holding together and it's working effectively. It's only when the constitution is broken, when Guy de Lusignan usurps the throne, that this country starts to fall. And even then, Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelins fight, or Balin and the Ibelins fight at Hattin, so that they still rallied around the king when they had an invasion. It's an unnecessary defeat. If Guido destroyed the Christian army at Hattin, there's no reason to think the kingdom of Jerusalem wouldn't have lasted another 100, 200, 300 years like Cyprus did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, that's true.
So, Helena, let's kind of look at this issue of Reynald of Chatillon and his relationship with Baldwin IV. Of course, just to kind of jump back to our popular culture reference, Kingdom of Heaven, we know that movie really portrays Baldwin IV. Well, for one thing, the portrayal of Baldwin IV is inaccurate because he's portrayed as desiring peace with the Muslims. He's not portrayed as a hardline, militant Christian warrior, which is what he was. He was a tough young warrior king. And Reynald of Chatillon is portrayed as kind of like this bumbling, violent for violence sake moron who just starts trouble.
I think, to be fair to the portrayal of Chatillon as terribly violent, he had a very violent past. He had invaded a Christian kingdom of Cyprus, for basically with very, very little legitimation. To raise the money for that, he put the Patriarch of Antioch in the sand, and there's various versions of how, but it basically...
Yeah, he was violent, but he wasn't incompetent, I guess is what I'm saying.
Exactly. I think there's Bernard Hamilton, in his biography of Baldwin IV, makes a very, very good case that Chatillon could not, for example, have launched the ships, the 5 or 6 ships in the Red Sea, which then, terrorized the Muslim pilgrim move, without support from the king. He didn't have sufficient resources. And he suggests, and I think very convincingly, that Chatillon would have had to have the tacit, if not active support of King Baldwin to do that. The other times when Chatillon breaks truces, he does it when it's very much to the kingdom's advantage. When the Nur ad-Din dies in Damascus, Saladin is in Egypt, and the key is preventing him from getting into Syria rapidly. And that's when Reynald de Chatillon launches his attack right down into Sinai, therefore keeping, as I say, Saladin out of Syria at a critical moment. So you have, and we'll have to do a separate talk about this because I don't have the facts.
Yeah. But
clearly, most of what Chatillon does in Baldwin IV's reign makes tactical sense.
Mm-hmm.
It does break the truces, but my theory is that may have been very much to Baldwin's advantage. He was able to make truces and then say, "Oh, I didn't have anything to do with Chatillon," but in fact, what Chatillon was doing was to his advantage and to the advantage of the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Yes. So bringing it back to Baldwin IV, what do we know of his domestic policies?
A lot less, and his record here is a lot less admirable. I think you can argue that his greatest mistake was inviting his mother back to court. His father had been forced to divorce her before being allowed to become king of Jerusalem. And although both the children by that marriage, basically all the children, that being Baldwin IV and his sister Sibylla, were recognized, she was banned from court. The reasons for that are somewhat obscure. But in any case, when Baldwin reached the age of maturity, he invited her back. And she had a very, very negative influence on him. She's credited with, for example, the counterproductive appointment of her utterly worthless brother Jocelyn of Edessa to the important point of Seneschal of Jerusalem, who distinguishes himself by surrendering the city of Acre to Saladin within 2 days of the Battle of Hattin, although the city was defensible. This guy was really bad news for the kingdom. Agnes was also responsible for the even more unsuitable choice of her former lover Heraclius for the post of Patriarch of Jerusalem. She was also responsible for choosing the husbands for both of Baldwin's sisters, and we all know that she chose Guy de Lusignan, and we all know what that did for the kingdom. So I think we can argue that Agnes was definitely bad news, and that was, probably, as I say, Baldwin's worst decision. Otherwise, I'm not aware of any significant, changes in the laws of Jerusalem during Baldwin's reign, because most of the histories focus so much on that continuous defensive policy and his foreign policy that I've seen nothing that suggests that he had any specific or particular, domestic policy that were worthy of note. Although I say that he did recognize Lusignan's weaknesses very, very soon. So although he's influenced by his mother to marry his sister to Lusignan, within a year and a half, he was doing everything he could to get her divorced again. So he at least recognized the error of his ways, at least in that case.
So where can we find out more about Baldwin IV?
The only really good biography that's out there right now is Bernard Hamilton's The Leper King and His Heirs, which is an excellent treatment of his reign. It really is a very, very good detailed description of the period, and it has very good information also about the demographics and other aspects which I think are too often neglected. Unfortunately, I think it really falls short as a biography, because you just never have the feeling, he doesn't bring Baldwin to life. You never have the feeling that Hamilton gotten inside his leprous skin and walked around it to help us understand him.
It was kind of more of a biography of Amalric I, Baldwin's father, which was interesting enough, but I kind of felt like still wanting to know more about Baldwin after reading it.
I think Hamilton is kind of working with what he's got. For the most part, we don't have a lot of intimate knowledge of medieval figures. Agnes,
yeah,
I do know, for example, the idea that Heraclius was her lover. That there is sort of an element of rumor to that, right? We don't know that for sure.
That's Ernol. It's the Chronicles of Ernol, and Ernol accuses her of having been, of course, being the.
And he was hostile towards their camp, so just like William of Tyre was. So.
But Tyre was a much more serious historian, whereas Ernol wrote in the vernacular, and was obviously not a scholar, and he was not a clergyman. He was not even trying to write a history. He was writing basically his memoirs. So he's generally discarded by historians as being, lightweight. And, for good reason. On the other hand, he was a contemporary. He was Leyland Evelyn's squire. he is at Springs of Cressa, he is at Hattin. And to totally discount him as a source is also sort of, we do that at our peril. He is quoted by a lot of later chroniclers as well. No, so we don't, there's no way of knowing if Agnes was the lover of Heraclius or of Amory de Lusignan.
Anyway, yeah, this has been a really great conversation. So Helena, thanks a lot for talking with us about Baldwin IV. So do you have any final closing thoughts on Baldwin?
Yeah, we covered a lot. I like I'll put in a plug for my own book. I mean, I did try in my current biography of Balian. Baldwin, of course, was a very, very important character, and I tried to do what I felt Hamilton failed to do. That is, I tried to really try to get inside his skin and his mind, and try to understand why he did the things he did, and and also how he would have been affected by what was going on around him, how he would feel. Try to get behind some of the psychological reasoning or impact of course, being in the environment he was in and suffering from the disease he was suffering. So,
Yeah, so that's your book, Defender of Jerusalem. Helena Schrader's...
Knight of Jerusalem, and the second book will be Defender of Jerusalem.
Right, yeah.
Edward Joseph has actually been released yet.
Yeah, so I'll put up some links to Knight of Jerusalem so that everybody can check it out. So yeah, thanks again, Helena.
Thank you.
One more time, let's also get your website.
Okay, we could do that. I actually think what's more useful is my blog. It's Defending Crusader Kingdoms at blogs. I can never get this out right. It's HTTP.
We'll link to it.
Let's go.
Yeah, Defending Crusader Kingdoms.blogspot.com, and that has the essays on various aspects of the Kingdom of Jerusalem.
Yes, and I will put a link to that in the about box. And and Deanna, too, thanks to you for being here. And let's go ahead and get your website too.
You can find me at www.crusadesandcrusaders.com or like my page, Everything Old History on Facebook.
And yeah, again, I'm J. Stephen Roberts. You can find me at realcrusadeshistory.com. So yeah, thanks again to both of you.